Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Kelly Sailing. I am the VP of Sales and Services for Visit Seattle. We are the founding partner with PCMA for Ascent. We are extremely proud to be associated with this particular activation, diversity and inclusion, something that we believe deeply in. Our sort of Seattle style of that is outside this room in the studio. We invite you to come check that out and see how we're celebrating diversity and inclusion. So we've got a video to show, and I wanted to show it first, if we can. This was a campaign that we launched via Instagram in June of this last year, celebrating Pride. So across the country, we celebrate maybe a day, maybe a week, maybe a month. And we decided to do a 365-day program with an image every day celebrating Pride. So diversity and inclusion in all sorts of spheres, and an example of something that is live if you are an Instagram follower and get to join us in that. Today's speaker is Lindsey Pollak. We get to introduce Lindsey. She is excited, just telling me about a new addition in her home, a 7-week-old guinea pig named Izzy, and Izzy's sister, Lizzie, I think will be joining soon. But Lindsey is here today to talk about multi-generational, particularly for an internal audience. A little bit of notes on Lindsey today. She's widely recognized as a leading voice on millennials and in the multi-generational workforce. She's often called a translator. Lindsey advises both young professionals looking to succeed in today's work environment and the organizations that want to recruit, retain, and market to them. As a LinkedIn ambassador for 6 years, she created and delivered webinars that has trained over 100,000 people. That is a lot, Lindsey, and more than is in the room today, to advance their careers. Currently, Lindsey serves as the chair of Cosmopolitan's magazine for Millennial Advisory Board. A quick note, welcome to the folks who have joined us virtually, and then we all get to fill out some session evaluations on the app afterwards, but please welcome Lindsey Pollak.
Thank you so much, Visit Seattle. That's the first time that my status as a new guinea pig owner has been my credential for being introduced at a conference, so I'm very happy to have that. I am so delighted to be with you for my very first PCMA to talk about today's unprecedented multi-generational workplace, and in particular, the rise of the millennial generation. Now, I know that millennials are a very hot topic and have been for several years. In fact, how many of you have, let's say in the past year, read an article, listened to a podcast, or attended a workshop about the millennial generation? And I know this is a savvy crowd. How many of you have written one yourself or delivered that one yourself? Okay, we have a lot in the room and probably many virtually as well. There is a reason that this topic is so important today. We have reached a tipping point in the generational conversation. So generationally, in 2016, millennials officially became the largest generation in today's workplace. Next slide, please. So millennials are now the largest generation in the United States workforce, overtaking the baby boomers who were dominant in our workplace, culturally, politically, economically, for roughly the past half century before the millennials came on the scene. This is a quotation here from the Pew Research Center. Next slide. So what's the big deal? Millennials have overtaken baby boomers. Those of us who have grown up in the United States, I know many of you are from other countries and certainly run events and have members and customers in other countries. This is something here in the US that we've been somewhat obsessed with. And if you can see from this collection of magazine covers that I put together for you, just of the past 50 years or so, we often tend to stereotype the generations, right? We tend to make fun of them. We tend to criticize them. I myself am a Gen Xer, like many of you probably. We were called the slackers, that we all hung out, notably in Seattle. Thank you again, Visit Seattle, with our grunge music and our coffee. And of course, millennials, I think because of the rise of the internet and the ubiquity of media today, millennials have probably been the most stereotyped generation, the most shamed generation. In fact, it was kind of hard for me to choose which Shaming Millennials magazine cover I would share with you today. So I went with Time magazine, the me generation. Millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents. Thought that kind of encapsulated all of the criticisms we have of the millennial generation. So we've been doing this for a long time. Next slide. In fact, I thought it might be fun to pull a quotation that could have been from any of these publications. I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today. That could be from this morning's Wall Street Journal. That could be from Gen Xers like me. That could be from, I don't know, the flapper era in the 1920s. Maybe, I don't know if you saw the play Hamilton, those crazy revolutionaries, right? In fact, this quotation is from the 8th century BC. We have literally been shaming our young people for all of human history. I want us to stop. I just said that millennials are the largest generation in the United States today. Why would we make fun of? Why would we criticize a generation that is so important to all of our organizations and all of our futures? So generational change is not a problem to be overcome. It's an opportunity to be leveraged. I think the organizations that continue to make fun of young people and criticize them and complain about them are going to lose that talent. And the people who embrace the new generations are going to be the ones that win the future. So let's look more in depth at generations. I know many of us are familiar with generational differences. And one of the reasons I love studying this topic, and I've been researching it for about the past 15 years, is that everybody understands the concept of generations because we're all members of families, which are really the original generational mix. Globally, almost every country has the concept of generations. I just pulled this chart to show you how common this concept is. But in different countries, there are different generational breakdowns. There are different words and names for each of the generations. But we all have this concept that over time, things change. The technologies we have access to, the media that we use, our cultural views and experiences are all very different. If you can look closely at this chart, one of the things that you'll notice is that in almost every country, not all, but almost every country now, we've seen a coming together of the naming of our most recent generation, millennials or Generation Y, which is a synonym. The reason for that, of course, is the internet and social media, particularly Facebook. Never before have we had one shared experience across the world that brings a generation together. So sometimes you might hear millennials referred to as the first global generation. But I'd like to focus today on the United States in particular, and this is a breakdown of how the generations are defined by the Pew Research Center. There are a couple things to notice about this chart. Number one is this is a little bit of an art, not a science. It's actually baby boomers who are the only generation to officially be designated by the United States Census Bureau as those born between 1946 and 1964. All the other generations have been deduced from that baby boomer center. The Pew Research Center I find to be the most reputable, but there is a little bit of variety in the years that you see. So if you grew up in a family with a lot of older siblings, you might identify a little bit older. Younger siblings, you might identify younger. If you grew up outside of the United States, you might identify with the age range in which you moved to this country. There's not really one day at the hospital where they sort of say, you are the very last Gen Xer, and the next baby born is going to be the very first millennial. So we have a concept of cusper, which is someone who feels a little bit like they have one foot in one generation, one foot in the other. Another thing to notice about this chart that's relevant to people who lead others is that we tend to have pendulum swings from a very big generation to a very small generation and back again. That's because generational size is based on birth rates, and birth rates are often really tied to the economy. So in tough times, people have fewer children, like the Great Depression, like the economic challenges of the 1970s when I was born, and people have more children in boom times, like the post-war era, the boomers, and the 1980s, the millennials. So what happens is you have generational change, but one generation is dominant over the next one. We see that with boomers being dominant over the Xers. There's simply more of them. And we're seeing this with millennials who are dominating over the Gen Zs. Gen Z is a relatively new term. That's those who are born about 1997 and later, so about 21, 22 and younger. We don't have an end date yet, but some of you may have seen in the news that Gen Zs are tracking as an even smaller generation than the traditionalists. They're calling it the second baby bust. Very few children born to this generation. So just as boomers have been incredibly dominant for half a century, millennials are going to be just as dominant in the years to come. So I'd like to look at this data one other way. This is the U.S. labor force over roughly the past 25 years. And what I'd like you to notice here is that in 1994, when this chart begins, there are only 3 distinct generations in the workforce: traditionalist, boomers, and Gen Xers. And then over time, what you see is not just that millennials and Gen Zs come in, but for the first time in our history, people are working longer in their careers. Partly because they want to, people are living longer, healthier lives, but also because people couldn't afford to retire because of the Great Recession. We have more Americans in the workforce today over the age of 85 than ever before in history. So we're seeing expansion on both sides. So in 25 years, we've gone from 3 generations that you would manage, choose benefits for, communicate with, develop an environment and workplace for, to 5 distinct generations. You could be sitting in a room in a meeting with people 50 to 60 years apart in age, and that has never happened before. So of course, when you start to talk about generations, you want to ask, who do we happen to have in this room today? Because who doesn't want to talk about their age with their colleagues at PCMA? So I thought we would do a quick poll to see what the multi-generational mix is in this particular room. You have some choices and I have some guidelines. If you do not feel associated with the generation in which you were born, I welcome you to choose the generation that you feel deep down inside. Often I get boomers who really feel like millennials. It never seems to go the other way. Millennials don't often feel like older generations, but if you feel a different generation, you may choose that. If you don't identify at all, you can choose F. And if you want to lie to look good in front of your colleagues, that's fine too. So let's see who we have. Those of you watching at home, you can think about which generation you are in. A is traditionalist, B is boomer, C is Gen X, D is millennial, also known as Gen Y, E is Gen Z, and F is choosing not to millennial. So the way the statistics are coming in, it is looking that we are about 60 to 65% millennial. Where are my millennials in the room? You can make some noise. And about 30% Generation X. Where are my Gen X people? All right, Gen Xers. And about 4% Gen Z in the room. Welcome, Gen Zs. And about 2% baby boomers. So very different from the workplace overall, but we are a very heavy Gen X millennial room. I'd encourage you to think about the team that you manage. What is the generational breakdown of the people in your particular organization or on the team that you oversee? So what? What does it matter if people are different ages? We're all people, right? Let's look at some reasons why this matters. And I really think of it as a cultural issue. Just as if you were going on a business trip to another country and you might choose to study the habits and preferences of a different culture, I think the argument can be made that people who grow up in different eras have different cultural experiences. Would you agree, using the United States as an example, that being born in the US, let's say in 1920, is in some ways a different country from being born here in 1960? Or is a different country from being born in 1990? Different technologies, different experiences, different cultural changes, the role of women, so many different factors apply. And I want to share a couple of statistics to show just how much has changed and how it impacts you as a leader. So here's a statistic on youth employment. Back in 1978, when older Gen Xers and younger boomers were in high school and college, 60% of teenagers worked in the summer. At a summer camp, mowing lawns, working at a retail store. Well, in 2016, just 35% of teenagers worked. So a lot of managers say to me, why aren't my young people showing up on time? Why don't they know what to wear to work? They don't seem to know how to behave in the workplace. We often think that it can be taken for granted that people know how to have a job. But today, more likely than not, you are the first employer a young person has ever had. Because young people today are going to enrichment programs in the summer. There are fewer seasonal job opportunities because the generations that are working longer in many ways are taking those jobs year-round, and they're not available for young people. There was a story recently out of Austin, Texas, where the municipal pools couldn't find lifeguards in the summer because the teenagers didn't want to be lifeguards. They were doing enrichment programs. They were doing unpaid internships to try to get jobs after college. So the pools in Austin, Texas said, well, why do you have to be a teenager to be a lifeguard? So they started hiring retirees who were in good shape, enjoyed being outside and helping people, and they said the big bonus of hiring the 55 and over crowd was that they could actually drive themselves to work. So we're rethinking what it means to be employed. Another statistic on cultural change relates to race and diversity. When you think of the traditionalist era, also known as the silent or greatest World War II generation, 22% of members of that generation identified as non-white, as a person of color. Today, 43% of millennials identify in that way. Gen Zs, those 21, 22 and younger, will be the first majority non-white generation in American history. That's a significant tipping point of the people in our country, the talent that we have access to, and the messages and images that we want to portray when recruiting and retaining talent. And finally, this is the stereotype proved a little bit true. For the first time in 130 years, young people aged 18 to 34 are more likely to live with their parents than in any other living situation. Is it because they want their mom and dad to continue to do their laundry? Why are young people living at home longer? Money. The financial crisis and the largest student debt accumulation in history. The average millennial has $28,000 in student loan debt. That's on average. So young people are making the prudent decision to live at home. They are not buying homes, not starting families because they don't want to. They are not doing many of these things because they can't. This means, as an employer, being thoughtful about where your young people are going home to. Being thoughtful about the fact that parents are very involved in the lives of many millennial children. According to an MTV study, 56% of millennials identify a parent as their best friend. LinkedIn, a company that I worked with for many years, has 85% of their employees under the age of 30. So take your daughters and sons to work day? It was a ghost town. So LinkedIn became one of the first companies in the United States to implement take your parents to work day, because they knew that that was the most important mentor, coach, and supporter in the lives of their employees. They also say on average about 1,000 parents sign up for LinkedIn memberships during those events, so they knew that it was their customer base too. So think about who is important in the personal lives of your employees. And finally, I want to share a chart that measures what we refer to as social trust. This is another chart from Pew, and at the end of the presentation, and for those of you watching online, I will give you a resource list of all the charts and surveys and statistics that I mentioned in the presentation. This one from Pew, I think, is really interesting on mindset. Pew every year asks Americans, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted? Not your friends and family, but the average person on the street. And what you see here is today, this is not a historical statistic, but today about 40% of baby boomers say, yeah, the average person you meet, I think you can trust them. Only 19% of millennials believe that the average person can be trusted. Why? We live in a time of social media, of people meeting on screens, not necessarily being able to verify facts about the people that we come into contact with. I think this number might even go down now that we are living in an era with the concept of fake news, of manipulation of data and images online. So we have a generation of young people, 81% of whom will walk into your workplace not trusting you simply because you hired them, but needing to decide to trust you. I work with many companies who say, I just have this feeling that I have to prove myself to my employees, that they're not giving me the benefit of the doubt. It's not your imagination. This is a cultural, widespread issue that is not personal. Societally today, we are not as trusting as we once were. What that says to me is your role as a leader, as an individual building relationships with other individuals, is more important today in our high-tech world than it's ever been before. So, here's what we do to manage this lack of trust, this cultural change, these 5 generations. First, we empathize. We learn about each other. And I actually find older generations are more understanding and empathetic to younger ones because we've been that age. Maybe we have children of that age. We've come along with the growth of those generations. It's often harder for young people to imagine what the world was like before they came. Number 2, we flex. I'm often asked, well, who wins when there's a conflict? Do the boomers win or do the millennials win? That's not the right question. It's not a zero-sum game where one win means the other generation loses. We have to flex for each other. Adapt and embrace the best solutions that are often a combination. Rather than thinking either or, I'll encourage you in my recommendations to think about and. And finally, assuming the best intentions. Voltaire once said, common sense is not so common. A question I often get is, why are my junior employees walking around with earbuds in their ears all the time? It drives me crazy. They're not paying attention. They're so distracted. And I often ask, do you think that they woke up in the morning and said, how can I really irritate my boss today? I know I'm going to wear my earbuds. No. When you actually ask, why are you wearing those earbuds? What do they always say? Millennials, why are you wearing the earbuds? Helps me concentrate. That's how I get more work done. I thought you wanted me to be more productive. This is how I do it. So when you stop to say, wait a minute, if you're doing it for the right reasons, we can have a conversation about this. I can say, you know what? Great. Wear them when you're working on spreadsheets. When clients are in the office, please take them off. But if you start from the assumption that people are trying to do the right thing, a lot of generational tension can be eliminated. To pull this all together, I wanted to share a concept that I've come up with based on my research with companies that are getting this right. And I have a new book coming out in May titled The REMIX. And the reason I chose that title is I really was thinking about the concept of music, a musical remix, where you take a classic song and you mix in something new. You change it, you adapt it, you remove something, you add something. You're not saying as a remixer that the old way or the classic was wrong or bad. You're simply updating it for a new time. So to be a remixer as a leader, what we'll talk about today is taking the best of the classic fundamental ways of managing people, of leading, but mixing in some new strategies that are coming from the innovation and disruption of younger generations. And we'll look at this in 3 particular areas. We'll talk about your leadership, how you actually manage others. Second, we'll talk about the experience of work, the work environment, work-life flexibility, career pathing, and finally communication, both as an organization and one-on-one to the people that you manage. So first we'll take a look at leadership in the multi-generational workplace. In the past, I think the message that many of us got who started our careers 40, 30, 20 years ago was do as you are told. Why? Because I said so. And we did it because that's the way it was. Why? You just did it. And now the message that a lot of young people are growing up with, from parents in some ways, the stereotype of the helicopter parent who's very involved in a children's life, from coaches, from tutors, from television, from YouTube influencers, is do anything you want. Express yourself. Be who you are. Well, those are very conflicting messages. There's no one way to combine them. What I think is the best way to remix those 2 concepts is to focus as a leader on coaching. And I define coaching as treating each employee as an individual with their best interests in mind. So you want them to be productive and effective and achieve your goal, winning, whatever that looks like in your organization, but you want to do that in a way that grows the employee. Now, this is particularly effective with the millennial generation. This is a study done by PricewaterhouseCoopers where they asked millennials, why'd you take your current job? And 65% of millennials said, because I want to develop personally. The last answer, as you can see, is for the money. Now, the cynical leader will look at this and say, typical millennial entitlement, here's how work works. You do a job and we pay you money. Learning, that's great. I hope you learned, but that's not why you're here. Many, many baby boomers and Gen Xers I talked to chose an entire career because it happened to pay a little bit more than the other job they were offered out of college, and that set them on a path. This doesn't mean money isn't important, and please don't go back to your office and say, this lady told us we don't have to pay you anymore because you just want to be developed. Please still pay your millennials. But this is a really strong message, and I think an incredibly important and positive message for those of us who are business event strategists planning trainings and workshops and conferences, is development has currency. What I say to the cynics is, in our world today, when every day we're reading stories about robots taking our jobs and entire industries being disrupted, your development, your skills, your agility has tremendous currency. Having a skill that I can put on my LinkedIn profile to help me get to the next level in my career, to not have my job taken over by automation, that has value to me. So the more I'm learning and growing and reskilling and developing, the better. And now that people are working longer, I think this appeals to all generations, but it starts and particularly resonates with the millennials. Another criticism commonly heard about millennials is all they want is feedback. Every minute of the day, they want to know how they're doing. They want a thumbs up. They want a like. They want a badge. They want a trophy for participation. And the statistics prove that a little bit true, that 72% of millennials do say that they would like to have feedback from their managers on a daily or weekly basis. But here's the thing. 60% of all the rest of us want that too. I think millennials want what all the rest of us have always wanted from our bosses. We just didn't get it and said, oh well, I guess bosses don't give feedback. I guess my manager isn't going to coach me. Because we weren't able to go online and read Glassdoor and Yelp and look at LinkedIn and have 900 other job opportunities. We stayed where we were. I think millennials want the kind of leadership that has always been effective. They are just going to leave if they don't get it. They are going to demand good management. What works for previous generations, if you're a good manager to one generation, you're a good manager. But millennials will not put up with those who are not effective. So one of my top recommendations is to go back to the basics, to the fundamentals. How many of you have read The 1 Minute Manager? Excellent. Lots of hands, and many of you watching online as well. This book was originally published in 1982, 37 years ago. Instant global bestseller. I wrote a book called Becoming the Boss, and I interviewed 100 leaders, and I said, what is the one book that has been most effective for you in learning how to manage other people? Not strategy, but actually managing human beings, and this was number one by far. I don't think it's a coincidence that this book, published in 1982, was re-released as the new 1 Minute Manager for the first time in 2015, just about the time when millennials were becoming the largest generation in the workplace. The concept is so simple. It's about regular, consistent, daily, 1 minute praise that is specific and 1 minute specific correction. Not waiting for an annual review, not doing a quarterly meeting, but constant updating and correction. Now, I know some of you might still be resisting this. Why should we spend all of our time coaching? I have other things to do. Why do we have to coddle the younger generations? I learned things the hard way. Why can't they? I want to share a story from the world of sports. There was an NCAA football coach who took his team to the finals, and there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about his leadership style. How did he get these young players to the pinnacle of success in their field? And he was very vocal about saying, I changed my management style for this younger generation. And what I learned, he said, is yelling just didn't work anymore. He said they didn't want to be yelled at. They didn't want to be disciplined. It didn't work. It had the opposite effect. They wanted mentoring. They wanted real relationships. They wanted coaching. They wanted shorter player meetings so they could check their Instagram followers. Now, as you can imagine, there was a lot of pushback on this from other coaches who said, yeah, this is football. We discipline. We yell. That's what works. And he said it wasn't working. And he said, the proof I have is that when I stopped yelling, we started winning. Now here's the differentiation. He didn't change the fundamentals. The players still had to do their drills. They still had to learn the playbook. They still had to eat healthy. They still had to lift weights. They still had to follow the rules. But the coaches changed their style to a method that was more effective with the culture that was comfortable for this generation. The fundamentals do not change. I had a chemistry professor who raised his hand in anger and he said, are you telling me if millennials don't want to learn the periodic table of the elements, I should stop teaching it? No. But do you think you could teach in a different way than you have been for 35 years? The question is, do you want to do what's effective with each generation, particularly the millennials? Or do you want to get revenge for all of the bosses who were mean to you when you were a young person? Now, some days I give you permission to choose revenge. I mean, once in a while, you got to go there. But for the most part, if you want to win, you have to do what is effective. So here are a couple of strategies and takeaways on how to bring this back to your team, to your office. Number one, I encourage you to schedule one-on-one time with every single person you manage, whether that's monthly, whether that's weekly. And the first agenda item should be set by that employee. What does that person want to talk about? What's on their mind? Agenda item U. Doesn't mean you have to do what they say, but taking time to listen is an underrated management skill. Number two, remember that common sense is not so common. Telling one generation to do something may not be the same as another. For instance, one of the phenomena I'm seeing across all industries is a lot of young people, millennials and Gen Zs, are not comfortable making business phone calls because they didn't have landlines as kids. You will be employing young people who have never answered a phone that was not for them, have never answered a phone where they didn't know who was calling from caller ID. So if you want a young person to answer a phone professionally and they don't know how, it doesn't mean that they're not intelligent. Apparently, I've read that IQ actually has gone up 1 point per generation, so maybe they're 1 or 2 or 3 points higher than you are in IQ. But what it means is they haven't had that experience. You have to teach it. So, being incredibly explicit with directions. I worked with a law firm, and the law partner said, these young people today, their writing is terrible. And I said, well, how are you coaching them to improve? And he said, I tell them, write better. Not particularly effective. So we came up with the idea that he started collecting what he considered to be examples of well-written work, memos and documents and briefs and emails, and he collected it into a big online file. And now when a new young person joins his team, he says, this is what excellence looks like. Because we all don't have the same markers of success. Young people can do this as well. Not everybody knows how to make a post go viral. This is what it looks like to do so. And finally, when giving your next assignment, one of the factors that I think resonates with every generation is to explain the why. I work a lot with industries where young people have to do a fair amount of grunt work, a lot of menial work that is not fun. We've all done it. We all have to do it. So I often ask in focus groups, if your boss gives you a job that you don't really want to do, what would make you do it with a smile? What would make it somewhat palatable? And over, the answer is always, just tell me why. Don't say you have to pay your dues, just do it because I said so. Nobody wants to hear that of any generation. But what we can say is, I know that this seems really boring, but it's incredibly important that we do our due diligence on these locations to make sure that they're safe for our participants. I know this work is tedious, but we need to double check the spellings of people's names because it's so important when they arrive that they feel welcome. I've even heard at airlines, and you might have noticed this now, people get irate when they hear the flight will be delayed by an hour. But when you add the magic word because, people are more comfortable. We will be delayed by an hour because there is weather in Seattle. Because is a magic word. Let's go on to our next topic, experience in the multi-generational workplace, what it's actually like to work in your particular environment. In the past, experience was you get what you get and you don't get upset. Henry Ford said you can have any color Ford you want as long as it's black. And now you would not dare take a child to buy a teddy bear, to pick from the pre-designed teddy bears that every other child gets. No, you take them to where? Build-A-Bear Workshop. So they can create the exact teddy bear that reflects their childhood goals and desires and hopes and dreams. Everything is customized. So that's difficult to pull together. What I think is a multi-generational solution, the REMIX, is to offer options and flexibility. We hear a lot about flexibility. It doesn't mean unlimited options. It means more options than you offer today. In other words, one size fits none. People want choices. And you might be surprised by the choices they make when you give them options. We can't make assumptions that one generation wants one thing, another generation wants another. This is particularly important, again, to millennials, 3/4 of whom say, when I have money, I would rather spend it on an experience than a product. Music sales are down. Concert sales are up. I don't want to buy the same thing everybody else has. I want to have an experience that's personalized and customizable that, by the way, I can share on social media. We see this in career pathing. For many of us, it used to be up or out, career ladder. Well, Deloitte was one of the first companies to pioneer the idea of career lattices so that it is not failing to decide that you want to make a lateral move, that you want to go down to part-time. It is not considered a bad career move to not move directly up the ladder. I would ask all of you, when you think of the members of your team, do you know what direction they want their career to go? You can manage them one way if they want your job, and manage them another if they want to start their own business someday. Manage them another if they want to go back to school. Manage them another if they're a boomeranging retiree who's there for a particular reason. These directions are unlimited now that we allow them. So how do you find out what people want? You have to ask. So many people call me in as a consultant and say, what do our millennials want? And I say, have you asked them? And they say, no, should we do that? And I say, yes, let's do that. Focus grouping, surveying, asking is so tremendously important. And PwC, again, is a really good example of this. When you get a job at PwC, you are given a questionnaire that says, why did you take this job? How does this fit into your career goals and dreams? We really want to know. They ask your work-life preferences. They don't assume that if you have no children, you want to work all the time. They don't assume that if you got a celebration, if you're rewarded, that you would want a bonus. They ask you what makes you feel rewarded. If you're a very introverted person, they want to know that so they don't throw you a surprise party and celebrate you. They celebrate you quietly. If you are an extroverted person, they want to know. I work at a virtual assistant firm in North Carolina, and they sent me a very similar questionnaire. And one of the questions that I loved said, when we want to get you a gift for your birthday, for the holidays, what would you actually enjoy? And I've gotten enough, steaks and cupcakes and wine in my life to say, well, those things are really nice and appreciated, but I really like manicures and pedicures. And so now every holiday season, I get a gift certificate to a manicure and pedicure, and it's meaningful to me. Do you know what is truly meaningful to the people who work with you? Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, which is, well, this is going to open a can of worms. They're going to say, we want more money. We want a party every Sunday. We want free M&Ms on Wednesday. Once you ask, I can almost guarantee that you will be surprised at how simple some of the requests are. And if they're not, I would follow the role model of Google. Laszlo Bock, their former head of people operations or HR, wrote a book about this. And one of the key practices at Google is when employees express a desire for something, the manager's job is to turn around and say, great, here's your budget, here are the parameters, why don't you come up with a plan? Task your people with creating the environment that they want. Task a multi-generational team with solving challenges. As Laszlo Bock says, you'll be stunned by what they accomplish. Encourage people to create the culture that they want to work in. So, a couple of suggestions on experience. What if you asked your team, if you could wave a magic wand, what is the one change you would most want to make in this workplace? I had the pleasure of speaking to several PCMA members before this session, and one was an association executive, and she said, we actually asked that question. And you know what the number one response was? Can we wear jeans on Friday? Cost $0 and made a huge difference to the culture. I once worked with a boutique investment bank, and they were having a lot of cultural challenges, and they said, I think they want more money, and I think they want this, and I think they want that, and we decided to ask them. And their junior employees came up with a list of their 10 biggest desires for changing the culture. And I presented the document to the managing partner of the firm, and he burst out laughing. I thought, this is either very bad or very good. And he said, that's it? He said, I don't know, pick 6. I don't want them to have everything. One of them was, can you please go back to the better orange juice in the fridge? When you start asking, you find out what matters to people is often the little things that make a huge difference. Next, task a multi-generational team. Be really deliberate that when you do task people with solving challenges, you make sure you're getting different generational perspectives. One company I work with calls them paper cuts. What are the little annoyances that are really bothersome that you could fix? There was one organization that said, we really want to eat lunch together, but we have to go out. We don't have room. We don't have a cafeteria. We don't have a lunchroom. We're a small office. So they tasked a multi-generational team, and the Gen Zs wanted to create an app for doing it, and they said, well, there's probably a simpler solution. And one person came up with the idea, what if we take our conference room, and from 12 to 1, it's always reserved for lunch? That was it. A simple solution that came from multi-generational thinking. And finally, I joke about trophies for participation, but trophies are meaningful when they're acknowledging really good work and when they are personal. Be honest, you threw away the trophies from childhood that said participant or finisher, and you kept the ones with your name engraved, am I right? You kept the ones with your name engraved. Can you think of one person on your team who's done a really good job lately? And don't just say thank you or great job, but thank that person in a way that you know will be meaningful. Maybe they have a long commute and you tell them to leave early next Friday. Maybe you know they love cinnamon lattes, and so you give them a gift card for that particular treat. Something specific and customized that doesn't just say thank you, but says I know you. I know what's important to you. And finally today, let's talk about communication organizationally and personally. In the past, there were a few people with powerful voices. I chose Walter Cronkite, whose famous line was, "That's the way it is, because I said so." Or the CEO, or the Pope, or the President. Certain people had voices, the rest of us listened and followed. Today, every conversation is two-way. Any one of you during this presentation right now can tweet to the world. That changes the dynamic of power. That changes the dynamic of communication. And I think in many ways makes so eyeball-to-eyeball, person-to-person communication even more important and valuable because it's become so rare. So the REMIX is not one-to-many communication or everybody talking loudly. It's more transparency and I think more authenticity. Now I know some people get heart palpitations when I talk about transparency. Note I didn't say all transparency or complete transparency. It's simply more transparency about the business, about clients, customers, events, outcomes, and about yourself. I often find people at the end of their careers start to share their stories and their secrets and their vulnerabilities. What if we did that all along the way of our careers? We're also terrible at helping other people understand how we personally like to communicate. I love this cartoon. I should just change my voicemail to please hang up and text me. Raise your hand if you hate voicemail. Does your team know how much you hate voicemail? What if we told people how to communicate? What if we told them, please don't text me when I'm home with my family? Or what if we said, I love your long emails, they're beautifully written, but I really prefer bullet points? What if we said, you know what, I'm kind of a formal person, I really like grammar and full-length words and capitalization. I love emojis, they're fun, but you know what, that just doesn't work with me. Or instead of popping into my office, I'd really appreciate if you could make an appointment on my calendar. Pet peeves. I had a boss early in my career who detested paper clips. There are so many other ways, she said, to combine paper that is more effective. If you gave her something with a paper clip, she got mad and annoyed and irritated. The problem was I didn't learn this until about a year into working for her. So I didn't know that I could present the most beautiful document in the world, but if it was collated with a paperclip instead of a staple, she was annoyed. We would have saved so much pain and suffering if she had simply told me that. Michael Watkins, who wrote the book The First 90 Days, is a Harvard Business School professor, says whenever you start a new job, whenever you start a new project, have what he calls the style conversation, which is how do you like to communicate? What's the best way to reach you? And for you to share that information in return. I think it is such a generous gift as a leader to tell other people what your preferences are. This also goes to sharing information, the transparency piece. 70% of employees across all generations say that they're most engaged when their leaders continually communicate company strategy. People want to know what is going on. It is a total disconnect when a boss says, I can't tell you that information, but I can go on Wikipedia and learn it. I've had a young person say to me, my boss said, you can't come to that client meeting. That's above your pay grade. You can't meet the client. And this young person said, I just wanted to say, that's okay. I'll just tweet him. The world we live in is that the most powerful people in the world are available and accessible to us or feel that way. Politicians, world leaders, CEOs use social media to communicate. So when we feel disconnected from our own organizations, it is even more off-putting because we feel we have so much access in the rest of the world. Where can you share that information? This also goes to the connection of meaning to work. I mentioned the lack of social trust, particularly with the younger generations, but even for baby boomers and traditionalists, more than 50% of people feel that they can't trust others. This is why when we find our work meaningful, when we're connected, when we have real relationships, when we have a passion and a purpose for the work that we do, we want to stay. Employees who find their work highly meaningful are 69% more likely to stay in their jobs. One of the best ways to connect across generations as a leader is to make sure that you are pulling your team together with not just a sense of getting our jobs done, but serving a greater purpose. And my favorite example of the shared sense of purpose is actually an historical one, an old one from back in 1961. Some of you may know this story. President John F. Kennedy, during the space race with the Soviet Union, was touring NASA headquarters, talking to people, chatting them up, very formal environment. And he walks up to a custodian at NASA, and he says, "Hello, sir. What is your job here at NASA?" And the custodian says, "Mr. President, my job is to put a man on the moon." We can do extraordinary things across generations and job titles if we all feel connected to each other. And the key to pulling the generations together is finding those remixes, those moments where your job title, your generation doesn't matter as much as the shared purpose that you have. So a couple of final takeaways before questions on communication. I encourage you, even here at PCMA, have a cup of coffee with a colleague of a different generation. Challenge yourself at lunch after this session, or those of you watching next time you go out, to sit with someone who is as different from you as possible. Ask them a lot of questions. Be a little bit vulnerable and share your experience. Those cross-generational relationships are critical for success today. Hold an Ask Me Anything or State of the Union session. If there are any attorneys in the room, I mentioned I work at a law firm, and one of the things they found is that a junior employee went up to a partner and said, "This is kind of embarrassing, but I don't really understand the billable hour." That's like the fundamental model of a law firm. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand why you're doing the work that you do in the way that you're doing it. Do the people who work for you know the economics of your business? Do they know what matters and doesn't matter? Don't make assumptions, and you want them to hear it from you rather than having to figure it out on their own or find out from someone who's not as good a source. And most importantly, successes you have at this conference, successes you have in your next big project, share them with every member of the team so that they feel that you're reaching the moon together. As I mentioned, I have a whole list of resources that I wanted to make available to you. So you can take out your phones and you can send a text with my name, Lindsey, to 66866, and I will send you both a list of all the resources today, and I'll also provide my email address. If you have any questions or comments about this session, I'd be happy to answer them. So with that, I will put this up on the screen again, but I want to thank you for your time today, those of you in the room and watching. And I know that we're only about 60% millennials, but I did want to provide all of you with a trophy for participating in this session today. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would be happy to take any questions from the virtual audience or the room. And if you do have a question, just raise your hand and we will send a mic your way. Looks like we have a question. Lynn, over here on this side.
I'm sorry, I crossed over.
Sorry to make you run all the way across the room. Oh, another one?
Are we on? Yes. Well, as a baby boomer, I get to go first, so sorry.
Where am I looking?
Just kidding. Hi, I have a question, Sally Forrest with Visit Phoenix. How most of what you were talking about seem to pertain to internal teams, the people we work with. Mm-hmm. Would you change any of that from a client perspective? So if I'm talking to a client of a different generation, do you think that dynamic changes at all?
I'm so glad you asked, because at 3:30 on this very stage, I will be running part 2 of this session, which is about leveraging multi-generational relationships with clients and customers. But I'll give you a quick preview now, which is I think many of the concepts are exactly the same. For instance, I think selling has become a much more consultative coaching process, particularly with the millennial generation. There's a desire, because we can find out so much information on the internet, that we want to work with vendors and event planners and strategists and associations that provide us with information. So the idea of the influencer comes to mind, that it's not just someone who says, buy my product, but who provides a tutorial or information with that product. I think on the second topic, experience, it is very related, which is that we live in a customizable and personalizable culture. As consumers, we want those experiences. So I think particularly you're seeing at events and at associations and even with corporate products and services, the desire to have personalized experiences. I've heard people say experience is the new swag. Don't give away a water bottle at your vendor booth. Have a virtual reality experience. And I think you can see that on display right here at PCMA. And certainly with communication, I think that we're definitely seeing a move towards customers and clients wanting more transparency from their vendors, whether it's on financials or on the ingredients in their products or anything behind the scenes is very valuable. So there's some nuances, and I'll talk a lot more about it at 3:30, but I think that the main themes are very, very much the same. Thank you for the question. Hi.
Hi. First of all, thank you. This was very helpful. I wanted to ask a follow-up question. So at our job, we do an employee engagement council where we try to identify ways that we can improve how employees feel engaged with the company mission, with each other, the work environment. And this council has been around for a while, and what we do is we put together sort of 3 target areas that we think are important. This year, it's been transparency, one-on-ones, many of the things that you've mentioned. However, in the past, those suggestions have been received but not acted upon. So what would you advise in that situation?
Are they not acted upon by leadership because they disagree with them, or it just kind of petered out and didn't happen?
I am not sure. I think it's a combination of both. But nonetheless, it is frustrating because it's a rather large company. We survey everybody, and to be asked for your opinion and then not see any action taken on it is very frustrating.
Unfortunately, that's really common and disappointing. It happens a lot. So I think there are a couple of things that you can do. One is to look at other companies that have done similar surveys but actually had a positive result and say, look, this is what happens when you take action on people's recommendations. And I'm happy to follow up with you and give some examples. One of the advantages you have of doing this work today is we basically have about 10 to 12 years of research on what actually moves the needle with having millennials in organizations. So Silicon Valley always comes to mind, but there's so many companies, Deloitte, PwC, many of the ones that I mentioned, Google, of course, that have done very specific things and really importantly measured them. So I think that's really important to share. Number 2, I think that there's a way, if you're on that committee, to spread some of those messages at a more micro level. So to have individual managers or leaders say, wow, we saw that people wanted more transparency. I decided to have a town hall with the 20 people I manage, and that person can trickle up that experience of how valuable and helpful it was to more senior leaders. Sometimes people want a pilot example of what works before they go really, really broad. But I would say if you choose to do that kind of survey, it's really important to take some action immediately because the disappointment of not doing so is worse than not having done it at all. So 2 suggestions, but I think that the importance of having some communication about what's happening would be really critical to kind of reintroduce that program. Thanks for sharing that.
And we do have a question from the virtual audience. It comes from
Great.
Katrine. She asks, what is your main advice for building strong bridges between the generations working together to learn from each other?
Great question. So I genuinely think it's that trust issue again, personal one-on-one relationships. It's actually incredibly rare for people to have friendships across generations outside of their family. We all have family members across generations, but think about it. How many people do you hang out with Not because you have to, because it's work or family, but because you've chosen to. So I think the more each of us proactively builds relationships, mentoring is such an easy way to do this. One of the trends I see now is reverse mentoring or co-mentoring, which is not that the junior person has to be advised by the wise elder, but that we share information with each other. So whether you implement a co-mentoring program or you simply take it upon yourself, as I mentioned, to go sit with someone of another generation and say, hey, I went to this workshop. What do you think? You're a millennial, or you strike me as someone of a different generation. It's a little awkward because you're talking about age, but usually you can make a joke about it. But I think those personal one-on-one relationships are really where it starts. And I think there are a lot of companies that are being more strategic about offering it, usually under the umbrella of a mentoring program.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. It was excellent. We've been, as a senior management team, talking a lot about these issues, and we also recently put together an HR advisory group with people who were not only from different generations, but had been in the workplace for different spans of time, so both people have been there long and short term. And it came to us the issues that were of importance to them. And one of them was something that was actually really important to the organization. So partnering with other organizations, that's really important to us. But the people in the office were feeling like this is just a lot of work and we don't understand why we do this. And so I wonder if you can comment a little bit about what to do when the answer is, well, we don't know why, and this is just more work, or when you task a committee to fix a problem and they say, well, that's just more work, how am I supposed to take that on with everything else that I'm doing? Because sometimes those are the comments we get. Mm-hmm. So we want to engage people, but when we get this comment back, then we're not really sure what to do with it.
It's a really problematic issue, and what I hear in that, and I could be wrong, is that this has happened before, and perhaps to your example, nothing happened, nothing changed. Often people are excited to take on more work if they feel like it's going to have a result. So I'm not sure how much power you have to change the people on that committee, but another Googleism that I like to follow from Laszlo Bock in the book that I mentioned, Work Rules, is he says, start with your stars. Even if your committee has 2 people, if those are 2 enthusiastic, excited people, start with them, and then they will recruit the next person in. So sometimes in a way, we have the best intentions that we want a diverse committee, that we want to have representation, we want to choose the people who have earned a place, but they don't actually want to be there. So I think the desire to be there and to have ideas is really important. Another thing that I would suggest, and I'm not sure how this would be taken, but to say, so you don't want to have a committee, do you think these are important issues? If so, instead of a committee, what do you recommend that we do? Should we do an online survey? Should we do this at our next volunteering event? Can we tie it into something else? I saw some nodding heads on the term pilot program. Can we have one meeting? So when people have pushback, I often ask, well, it sounds like that doesn't really work for you. What do you suggest as an alternative? So I think either choose different people, even if it's smaller, or ask them for a particular alternative. I also think showing examples of success or pockets of success within the organization. Well, our work-life committee was really successful, or our UNICEF fund drive was really successful. Let's learn from them what actually happens. I think we often think there's some perfect model of committee success or multi-generational success. It's really taking what works in your organization and applying this particular topic to a strategy or an ethos that's already working that can be helpful. But it's great that you're approaching the topic. One last question in the back of the room, if we can get a microphone there. Thank you. Oh, that is really a runner. You are literally running. Great job. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really liked it. Do you have any suggestions, sort of the opposite of what we were talking about today, for millennials in the workforce who are now in a management position and now having to managing Gen Xers and even baby boomers?
Yep, so a really challenging position. I think something like 36% of Americans today report to a boss who is younger than they are. So more common than it's ever been to have this scenario. And so a couple of things, and I've blogged about this a lot. I can send you some articles. Number one is, I think a lot of people assume that the older person will be uncomfortable when often they're not. So the first thing I would say to millennial is don't assume that they're going to find it problematic. I had one manager say to me, I've been through so many reorgs, honey, I could report to a dog at this point. So Some people don't mind, and you don't want to make it an issue if it's not. Number two, I talked a lot about listening and asking. I think when you come in as a more junior person, younger, really respecting the experience and opinions of the older person, particularly if they've been at the organization longer. Often you see a younger person come in from outside. Those one-on-one times, first agenda item is you. What do you want to tell me? Really listening first is incredibly powerful in those situations. And third, I would go back to what I said for all leaders, which is explaining the why. A lot of people might assume you made that decision because you don't know what you're doing, or you made that decision because you want to disrupt, or you want to make it more technological. If you can come in and say, well, I know this decision might not be popular, it's different than it was before, this is why we're choosing to go in this direction. You are acknowledging and respecting that the other people might disagree, but you're choosing to give a reason that is not just, I'm the new kid in town and I'm going to make changes. So don't assume there's a problem if there's not. Listen first and always explain the why. And I've often found in those situations, believe it or not, it can be more problematic for millennials in particular who've grown up with social media and a very democratized generation. I often find there's more challenge managing your peers as a millennial than there is managing those who are older. So the dynamic can be really different depending on the situation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
With that, I will thank you again for coming. If you're interested in the client perspective, I will see you at 3:30. Thank you, Visit Seattle, and thank you, PCMA. Thank you, virtual attendees as well.